Cowboy, is the bulge between my legs what draws you in? Is that why you act so odd?" The town of Red Creek was small, quiet, and the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business before it even happened. Dust swirled over the wooden streets in the hot afternoon sun, and the smell of fresh hay mixed with the faint smoke from chimneys. People went about their days with a routine rhythm: farm work, tending to animals, a visit to the general store, and evening chats on porches. Outsiders were rare, and when one arrived it caused a ripple that could not be ignored. It was during one of these ordinary afternoons that a new person arrived in town. They walked with a calm confidence, carrying themselves in a way that suggested they had seen many places and met many kinds of people. Their presence was subtle, yet it had a weight that could not be overlooked. The townsfolk noticed quickly, exchanging quiet glances as they watched the newcomer pass. Something about them was different, not in dress, not in voice, but in the kind of energy that made people pause and wonder. Among those watching closely was the cowboy. He was a man shaped by hard work and the land he loved. His hands were calloused from years of handling ropes and tending cattle, and his face was tanned and weathered from long days under the sun. Life for him was simple: work, eat, sleep, and repeat. He was not used to noticing things that went beyond the practical and immediate, yet this new person drew his attention in a way he did not understand. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself that the town was small and that curiosity was natural. But the more he saw them, the more he felt a pull he could not explain. The newcomer began working at the local stables, helping with feeding, cleaning, and riding the horses. They were skilled and patient, handling even the most stubborn animals with ease. Townsfolk started to notice not just their work ethic, but the way they moved and spoke: careful, thoughtful, and quietly confident. People whispered, some out of admiration, some out of suspicion. Rumors were a kind of currency in Red Creek, and a person who stood out too much was often the target. The newcomers sensed this, but kept their focus on the work, on the horses, and on learning the rhythms of the town. The cowboy found himself watching more than he cared to admit. Sometimes it was just for a moment, from across the corral, seeing the way the newcomer handled a horse, or laughed at a small joke. Other times it was longer, almost as if he could not look away. He felt strange about it, uncomfortable and fascinated all at once. This was not something he had experienced before. He was used to seeing beauty in nature, in the land, or in the hard work of life, but this attention he felt toward another human being was new and confusing. He began to notice little things: the way they brushed dust from their clothes, the way they smiled when they thought no one was looking, and the way they seemed to move with ease in the world that felt heavy and slow to the townsfolk. He felt drawn to these small details, yet he did not understand why. It made him act awkwardly around them, unsure of how to behave. But sometimes he would speak, trying to make conversation about work or horses, but his words came out short or jumbled. Other times he would avoid them entirely, telling himself he had things to do elsewhere. The more he tried to hide his curiosity, the more it showed, and the more tension he felt growing inside.
The newcomer noticed, too.
They were quiet and careful, but they had a keen sense for the moods of others. They could tell when someone's attention lingered too long, when someone was uncomfortable, and when someone was curious in a way that went beyond ordinary interest. The cowboy's strange behavior did not go unnoticed.
At first, they were patient, thinking perhaps he was just shy or reserved.
But over time, the pattern became clear. He would watch, he would linger near, and then he would retreat, always acting as though he was trying not to notice. This unspoken tension began to shape their interactions. Simple exchanges became charged with meaning neither fully understood. A greeting felt like a test, a passing glance like a question, and silence carried more weight than words. The townsfolk, ever observant, noticed the subtle shift between the two. They whispered in corners, wondering what it meant. speculating about feelings and intentions. The newcomer felt the weight of those whispers and the curious glances. They realized that their presence alone was stirring emotions and thoughts they had not anticipated. Despite the quiet tension, life went on. Work needed to be done, horses needed attention, and the routines of the town continued. Yet beneath the surface, the connection, or rather, the mystery, between the cowboy and the newcomer began to grow. It was not a connection of friendship or romance at this point. It was something more basic, something human and instinctive. Both were aware of it, though neither could name it. It was the weight of noticing someone else, a feeling pulled by something you do not understand. In the evenings, the cowboy would sometimes sit on the porch after a long day of work, looking out at the fading light and thinking about the newcomer. He would recall the way they moved, the quiet confidence they carried, and the subtle way they seemed to belong and not belong at the same time. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, that his attention was just curiosity or boredom, but deep down he knew it was more complicated. He could not shake the feeling, no matter how much he tried. The newcomer, meanwhile, found solace in the quiet moments alone in the stables or walking along the fields. They reflected on the small town and its people, realizing that being different, even slightly, was a challenge here. The tension from the cowboy's gaze was just one part of it. They had encountered stares, whispers, and assumptions before, but never so persistent, so quiet, and so personal. They felt a mix of frustration and curiosity, wondering what it was that caused this strange behavior. Days passed, and the tension grew, like a slow river carving its way through rock. Neither spoke directly about it, but each encounter carried the weight of unspoken questions. The cowboy was becoming more aware of his feelings, more conscious of his reactions, and more determined to understand them without revealing too much. The newcomer was equally alert, learning to navigate the delicate space between attention and privacy, curiosity and respect. By the end of the first week, the entire dynamic of the town seemed to shift subtly. The newcomer had become part of the town's rhythm, but they were also a point of focus, a silent question that lingered in every glance and gesture. The cowboy found himself thinking more about them than about the work he normally loved, the land he cherished, or the routines that had shaped his life. And while he did not understand it, he could not ignore it.
It was in this quiet, tense, and slowly unfolding rhythm that part one of the story ends. The stage is set for the conflicts, misunderstandings, and revelations to come.
The small town, the hard-working cowboy, and the quiet, confident newcomer exist now in a delicate balance. Every glance, every whispered word, every subtle gesture has meaning. And in this quiet beginning, the story waits, ready to unfold, with curiosity and human emotion pulling everyone toward moments they cannot yet see, but will soon face. Life in Red Creek continued, but it had changed ever so slightly since the newcomer arrived. The rhythm of the town remained the same on the surface. Horses were fed, fences were repaired, and the sun rose and fell over the dusty streets. But underneath, a quiet tension was growing. The cowboy could feel it in every glance he exchanged with the newcomer, in every small gesture, and even in the way the townsfolk seemed to watch more carefully than before. The cowboy tried to maintain his routine. He rose early, saddled the horses, and worked in the fields from sunrise until the heat forced him indoors. He told himself that this was all there was to life, that curiosity was a dangerous distraction, and that the newcomer was simply someone passing through who would eventually leave. But despite his efforts to focus on work, his thoughts kept returning to that quiet presence in the stables. He found himself remembering small details, the way the newcomer's hands moved when brushing a horse, the subtle tilt of a head when listening, the quiet confidence in their posture. He began to act differently around others, too. Conversations with neighbors became shorter, and he sometimes avoided eye contact. The townsfolk noticed, of course, and they whispered behind his back. Some thought he was falling for the newcomer, Others believed he was acting strangely because of something hidden in his past. The cowboy did not care about gossip, yet he could not escape the feeling that the town's curiosity was pressing against him, making him more aware of every word, every look, every moment. Meanwhile, the newcomer sensed the change in him. They noticed the way he lingered too long near the stables, only to disappear before speaking. They saw the small, awkward gestures, an attempt to offer help, a hand that hesitated, a smile that seemed almost nervous. They were patient at first, thinking he was shy or reserved, but the repetition of these behaviors began to feel deliberate. There was an unspoken message in his actions, something that tugged at the edges of understanding. It was not anger or hostility, but a kind of tension that neither of them could yet explain. The town's atmosphere added another layer to the situation. Red Creek was small enough that everyone knew one another, yet it was cautious, slow to accept change. Outsiders were rare, and anyone who stood out immediately drew attention. The newcomer, despite their quiet demeanor, could not help but be noticed. People whispered about them at the market, in the saloon, and on front porches. Some admired their confidence, some feared it, and others simply speculated about who they were and what they wanted. The cowboy, caught in the middle, felt both protective and uneasy. He did not fully understand his own feelings, but he could sense the town's scrutiny weighing on the newcomer. One afternoon, the cowboy found himself walking toward the stables without really thinking about it, but the sun was hot, the dust clung to his boots, and the horses were restless, but all he could focus on was the figure at the far end of the corral. The newcomer was brushing a horse with gentle, precise strokes, their eyes calm and focused. The cowboy paused, feeling a strange mix of admiration and frustration. He wanted to speak, to ask a question, to bridge the distance that had grown between them, but every time he opened his mouth, the words failed him. The newcomer looked up and noticed him, but they did not approach. Instead, they continued their work, their expression calm but alert. It was as if they knew he would come closer eventually, but they also respected the space between them. This silent exchange, filled with tension and curiosity, lasted for several minutes. The cowboy felt the weight of every glance, every subtle movement, and finally he turned away, leaving the corral without saying a word. That evening, he sat on the porch with his thoughts. He tried to convince himself that it was normal to be curious about someone new, but he knew it was more than that. There was a pull he could not name, a feeling that something about the newcomer had touched a part of him he did not understand. He wondered if it was simply their confidence, their difference, or something deeper that he could not yet articulate. The more he thought about it, the more restless he became. The newcomer, on the other hand, was reflecting on their own experience. They were used to being noticed, but rarely in such a quiet, observing way. Most people either ignored them or stared outright, but the cowboy's attention was different. It was subtle, careful, and filled with unspoken questions. They began to see the pattern of his behavior. The lingering glances, the awkward movements, the moments of avoidance. It was clear that he was struggling with something, though whether it was curiosity, fear, or admiration, they could not tell. As the days passed, their interactions became more complex. Small moments, like passing each other in the barn, exchanging a brief nod, or sharing a tool, carried more meaning than either of them expected. The cowboy found himself thinking ahead to these encounters, planning, worrying, and hoping that he could manage his own reactions. The newcomer noticed this too, and while they did not fully understand it, they began to anticipate his hesitations and movements. It was a silent dance of observation and response, one that neither could yet name but both felt deeply. Rumors in the town began to stir more actively. People noticed the tension and started to speculate. Some thought there was a secret between the two, while others believed the cowboy had never met anyone like the newcomer before. These whispers, though quiet, added pressure to an already delicate situation. The newcomer felt it, though they tried to ignore it, focusing instead on their work and on maintaining their composure. The cowboy felt it as well, and it made him more self-conscious, more hesitant, and more aware of the way every action might be interpreted. Despite the tension, there were moments of small connection. Sometimes the cowboy would find himself helping the newcomer with a task, lifting a heavy bale of hay or guiding a stubborn horse, and for a brief moment the awkwardness disappeared. They shared simple smiles, exchanged quiet words about the work, and experienced a fleeting sense of understanding. These small moments were precious, yet they also reminded the cowboy of how much he did not understand, how much he was still learning about himself, and how different the newcomer was from anyone he had ever met. By the end of the second week, both the cowboy and the newcomer were acutely aware of the unspoken tension between them. It was no longer just curiosity, it had become a quiet awareness, a recognition of difference, and the challenge of understanding it. The cowboy struggled with his feelings, unsure whether they were admiration, respect, or something more complicated. The newcomer was patient but vigilant, aware that the tension could escalate or dissipate depending on how it was handled. In this growing awareness, life in Red Creek continued. The town itself remained unchanged on the surface, with its dusty streets, wooden buildings, and daily routines. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something subtle and powerful was developing. A silent connection, a tension that neither could ignore, and a curiosity that demanded attention. Both were learning, both were observing, and both were preparing, in their own way, for the next stage of understanding that would come. And so, Part 2 ends with a quiet but palpable tension. The cowboy's curiosity has grown, his awareness sharpened, and his feelings complicated. The newcomer remains calm, observant, and patient, aware of the strange behavior directed toward them. The town hums with whispers and speculation, adding weight to an already delicate situation. The stage is set for the next phase, where questions will be asked, emotions will be tested, and both the cowboy and the newcomer will be forced to confront the truth of their unspoken connection.
By the third week, the quiet tension between the cowboy and the newcomer had grown thicker.
It was no longer just curiosity or a passing interest. It had become something that the townsfolk could sense, even if they could not put it into words.
People whispered in corners, exchanged knowing glances at the general store, and speculated about what might be happening. Some thought the cowboy was falling for the newcomer. Others believed he was acting strange because the newcomer reminded him of someone from his past. None of the guesses were confirmed, yet all added to the weight of expectation that hung over the small town like the hot, dusty air. The cowboy noticed the whispers but tried to ignore them. He told himself that it was none of his concern, that he had work to do and that the town would eventually move on to other topics. Yet every time he saw a group of people looking in his direction, he felt a strange, uncomfortable awareness, desperation. It was as if every eye on him reflected a question he could not answer. He tried to focus on routine, feeding the horses, mending fences, checking the water troughs, but even the simplest tasks were colored by the tension he felt. The presence of the newcomer had become a constant thought he could not shake. The newcomer, meanwhile, was fully aware of the quiet scrutiny. They sensed the way the townsfolk were watching, and they could feel the undercurrent of judgment in every glance. Unlike the cowboy, however, they had learned to carry themselves with calm and patience. They did not react to whispers or speculations, instead letting their work speak for itself. Best. Still, they could not ignore the cowboy's strange behavior. His hesitations, his lingering glances, and his awkward gestures made them more aware of the unspoken tension between them. One afternoon, a small incident pushed the tension into the open. A horse in the corral became startled by a sudden noise. The newcomer moved quickly, guiding the animal back to calm with steady hands and a quiet voice. The cowboy, noticing their skill, stepped forward instinctively to help. In that moment, their hands brushed while holding the rope, and both felt a sudden, sharp awareness of proximity. It was brief, almost imperceptible to anyone else, yet it left both of them shaken. After the incident, the cowboy lingered, unsure whether to speak or to leave. The newcomer glanced at him, calm but watchful, and offered a small, polite smile. Words were not needed, but both felt the weight of the unspoken connection. The townsfolk who watched from a distance whispered even more. Some thought it was a sign of friendship. Others speculated about feelings that might be developing. The cowboy felt self-conscious, aware that his every action was being observed and interpreted. Past. The town's gossip began to affect the newcomer as well. People were subtle, yet their curiosity was obvious. They offered extra attention at the general store, lingered with questions about work, and sometimes watched from porches when they thought no one was looking. The newcomer had dealt with attention before, but this felt different. It was quiet, constant, and filled with expectations that neither of them had agreed to. They had to balance their own sense of self with the awareness that the town was watching and that their every move might be misread. The cowboy's internal struggle intensified. He tried to convince himself that his interest was purely practical, that he admired the newcomer's skill with horses or their confidence in handling difficult tasks. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. There was a pull he could not explain, a fascination that made him uneasy, and a curiosity that bordered on obsession. He found himself thinking about the newcomer at odd moments, in the early morning light, during the quiet of midday, and late at night when the town was still. It was distracting, confusing, and increasingly difficult to ignore. The newcomer, for their part, began to notice the pattern of his behavior more clearly. They saw how he lingered in places where they worked, how he seemed to anticipate their movements, and how he sometimes offered help that was unnecessary but clearly intended to be noticed. Bah. They remained calm and patient, yet inside they were growing curious themselves. What was it that made him act so strangely? Was it admiration, confusion, or something deeper? They did not know, but they were determined to find out in their own time. Small conversations between them became more charged, though neither fully realized it. A simple remark about the weather, a brief comment on a horse's behavior, or a short instruction about a task carried more meaning than either of them could articulate. Each exchange left both of them feeling slightly awkward, slightly aware, and slightly exposed. Yet these moments also built a connection, a recognition that they noticed each other in a way that no one else did. The town, always attentive to differences, began to speculate more boldly. Whispers became slightly louder, and glances more pointed. The newcomer's quiet competence and calm demeanor were admired by some, feared by others. The cowboy, caught in the middle, felt the pressure of expectation both from the town and from himself. He wanted to understand his own reactions, but fear, uncertainty, and the weight of judgment held him back. One evening, the tension reached a subtle peak. The cowboy was returning from checking fences when he saw the newcomer alone in the stable, feeding the horses. Something compelled him to approach. He carried a small bucket of water, an excuse to be near without drawing attention.
As he handed it over, their fingers brushed once again. The touch was brief, accidental, yet electric in its simplicity.
Both of them froze for a moment, feeling the intensity of the unspoken connection. Neither spoke. Neither moved. The silence itself was heavy with meaning. The incident sparked more reflection than conversation. The cowboy began to question himself in a way he never had before. Why did such a small gesture affect him so strongly? Was it the newcomer's presence, the careful confidence, or the awareness of being observed? He did not have answers, and that was what made it both fascinating and frustrating. The newcomer, meanwhile, remained calm but thoughtful. They said, the subtlety of the cowboy's actions, the hesitation, the lingering gaze, the small efforts to be near.
They did not confront him directly, but they began to pay closer attention, learning to anticipate his movements and intentions.
It was a delicate balance, requiring patience, and awareness. They knew that whatever was happening between them was important, yet undefined, and that understanding it would take time. As days turned into weeks, the pressure of unspoken questions grew heavier. The cowboy found himself analyzing every interaction, trying to decode meaning in the simplest gestures. The newcomer noticed, too, the subtle patterns and inconsistencies in his behavior. Both were aware that something unspoken existed between them, a tension that was more than curiosity, more than admiration, but not yet fully named. The townsfolk continued to watch. They did not understand what was happening, but they sensed that it was unusual. Some whispered about hidden feelings. Others speculated about misunderstandings or unspoken conflicts. The newcomer, aware of these glances and comments, remained composed, focusing on the work at hand while also observing the cowboy's reactions. The cowboy, meanwhile, felt the weight of the town's gaze, but was even more concerned with the newcomer's perception of him. By the end of Part 3, the story had reached a moment of quiet tension. Rumors and speculation had begun to touch both characters, even though neither had spoken openly about the feelings, confusion, or curiosity they carried. The cowboy was struggling to understand his own emotions and behavior, while the newcomer was learning to navigate both the town's attention and his subtle reactions. Both were aware of a connection, though neither had yet named it, and the unspoken tension had grown into something that demanded attention, patience, and understanding. The stage was set for a turning point, where questions would be asked, misunderstandings confronted, and truths quietly revealed. Part 3 ends with both characters suspended in a delicate balance, aware of each other, aware of the town, and aware that their lives were quietly changing in ways that neither could yet predict. The tension that had quietly grown between the cowboy and the newcomer finally reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Days and weeks of glances, hesitations, and whispered speculation in the town had built a silent wall between them. A wall made of curiosity, unspoken questions, and the weight of being watched. Both of them felt it, yet neither knew how to break through. And then, one afternoon, something happened that forced the silence to begin cracking. It started with a small task in the stables. A horse had become uneasy, shaking its head and stamping its hooves nervously. The newcomer approached carefully, speaking softly, and running their hands over the horse's coat with gentle movements. The cowboy, noticing the tension in the animal, instinctively stepped forward to offer help. Their hands brushed briefly while holding the rope, and both paused for a moment. This was not the first time their fingers had met, but this time there was a heightened awareness, a sudden recognition of the unspoken tension that had been growing between them. The cowboy looked up, unsure what to say. For days he had rehearsed questions, excuses, and small remarks in his head, but now, with the moment in front of him, words seemed impossible. The newcomer met his gaze calmly, waiting, as if expecting him to speak. There was no hostility in their expression, only quiet patience and a sense of curiosity that mirrored his own. Finally, the cowboy found his voice, though it was quiet and hesitant. I don't understand why I act the way I do around you," he said, pausing to look away. I notice things, I watch, and He stopped, realizing that every word he could choose seemed inadequate, awkward, or wrong. The newcomer nodded slowly, encouraging him without speaking. "It's all right," they said finally. "I've noticed. I see how you behave, and I understand that it's confusing for both of us." Their calm voice held no judgment, only recognition of what had been building for weeks. The cowboy swallowed hard, trying to make sense of his feelings. Rest. I don't know if it's curiosity or respect or... His voice trailed off. I feel different around you, and I don't know why. Bah. The newcomer smiled faintly. You're not the only one, they said. I notice you, too. Brr. Your attention, your hesitation, the way you try to balance what you feel and what you think is expected, I notice all of it. It was a moment of quiet revelation. For the first time, both of them spoke openly about the tension that had been simmering between them. Words that had been unspoken for weeks were finally allowed to exist in the air. The awkwardness, the curiosity, and the confusion were no longer hidden. They were acknowledged, shared, and understood in a simple, human way. The cowboy felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. He had feared this moment for days, worried that speaking aloud might ruin the fragile connection he sensed. But now that it had happened, he realized how freeing it was to speak, even imperfectly, about the emotions he could not previously name. He felt lighter, more aware, and more connected to the newcomer than ever before. The newcomer remained patient, allowing him to find his words and process his feelings. They understood that this was not a moment for rushed conclusions or hasty confessions. Instead, it was a moment of truth, where honesty and observation could coexist without pressure. We don't need to define anything right now, they said. We just notice. That's enough for now. In the days following this conversation, the dynamic between them began to change. The awkward gestures and hesitations became less frequent, replaced by small, meaningful exchanges. A nod here, a smile there, or a shared laugh over a stubborn horse created moments of connection that neither of them could ignore. The cowboy felt more at ease in their presence, though still aware of the curiosity and tension that remained. The newcomer continued to observe, learning to read his expressions and reactions without judgment, and allowing the connection to grow naturally. The town, as always, remained watchful. People noticed subtle changes in the cowboy's behavior. He was less hesitant, more confident in his interactions, and occasionally smiled in ways that seemed to surprise those around him. The newcomer, too, was observed, their calm demeanor and skill still drawing attention. But now, the whispers of speculation carried less weight. The unspoken truth between them was no longer a mystery to each other, and that quiet understanding was stronger than any rumor. Despite this progress, challenges remained. The cowboy still struggled with the intensity of his curiosity and the complexity of his feelings. He worried about missteps, misunderstandings, or moments when the town might misinterpret his actions. The newcomer, aware of his internal struggles, remained patient but attentive, providing silent reassurance through calm presence and consistent behavior. Together, they navigated the delicate space between attention, curiosity, and understanding, learning how to balance emotions without forcing conclusions too soon.
A small, ordinary moment became a turning point.
The two of them were repairing a fence at the edge of the pasture, the sun low in the sky casting long shadows over the dusty ground. They worked side by side, hands occasionally brushing against each other, yet without awkwardness or hesitation this time. Words were exchanged. Simple remarks about tools, measurements, and the sun, but beneath them there was an unspoken acknowledgement of the connection that had grown. The cowboy felt calm, focused, and more self-aware. The newcomer felt a quiet satisfaction in seeing the change, understanding that patience and observation had led to this point. As the work ended and they stepped back to observe the repaired fence, a sense of quiet accomplishment filled the air. It was not just the fence that had been fixed, but also the fragile barrier that had existed between them. The tension had not disappeared entirely, but it had shifted into something manageable, something that could be acknowledged without fear. That evening, the cowboy sat on his porch, thinking about the day and the conversation that had changed everything. He realized that understanding himself had been the first step toward understanding the newcomer. He had feared his own curiosity and the weight of his attention, but speaking openly had relieved some of the burden. He felt a new sense of clarity, even if it was only partial, and he was determined to continue learning and observing without pressure, without judgment, and without fear. The newcomer, in their own quiet way, reflected on the progress as well. They had seen weeks of awkward glances, hesitation, and tension, and now those moments had evolved into recognition and understanding. They understood that true connection required patience, observation, and respect for boundaries, and they were willing to continue navigating this delicate balance alongside the cowboy. By the end of Part 4, the story had reached a turning point. The unspoken tension had been acknowledged, curiosity had been expressed, and a fragile connection had begun to grow into understanding. Both characters were aware of their feelings and reactions, and they had taken the first steps toward clarity without forcing definitions or conclusions. The town remained as observant as ever, but the true connection existed quietly, privately, and meaningfully between the two. The stage was now set for the final part, where the challenges of the town, misunderstandings, and internal emotions would reach a resolution. Both the cowboy and the newcomer had grown through patience, observation, and honesty, preparing them for a moment where choices would be made, feelings would be fully confronted, and quiet truths would finally emerge. The days in Red Creek had begun to settle into a quieter rhythm. The tension that had grown between the cowboy and the newcomer was no longer hidden, but it had transformed into a careful understanding. Both had spent weeks navigating unspoken glances, awkward hesitations, and quiet curiosity, learning the art of patience and observation. Now in Part 5, the story reached its final chapter where choices, understanding, and emotional clarity would emerge. The morning began like any other, with the sun rising slowly over the dusty streets and the smell of hay and horses filling the air. The cowboy awoke early, as he always did, and made his way to the stables. This time, however, he moved with a calmness he had not felt before. The awkwardness of previous weeks had eased, replaced with a sense of purpose and quiet confidence. He knew he had to confront his feelings, not with grand gestures, but with honesty and simplicity. The newcomer was already at work, feeding the horses and checking the fences. They looked up as the cowboy approached, offering a small smile that held warmth and patience. The cowboy returned the smile, feeling a rare sense of ease. Weeks of uncertainty, tension, and silent questioning had led to this moment. Now both could exist in the same space without fear, without confusion, and without unnecessary hesitation. "Good morning," the cowboy said, his voice calm but deliberate. I've been thinking. A lot." The newcomer nodded, listening without interruption. They had learned that rushing or pushing for answers only made the situation more complicated. Patience had been the key, and now it was time for clarity. "I realized that. I've been noticing things about you for a long time," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "Your presence, the way you move, the way you handle things, it's different. And it made me act strangely. I wasn't sure why, and I didn't want to make mistakes. But I respect you. I respect who you are, and I want to understand it better." The newcomer listened quietly, their expression calm and thoughtful.
"I understand," they said at last. "I've noticed your hesitation, your curiosity, and your care."
It's clear you're trying to figure things out, just as I have. That's part of being human, learning about yourself while noticing others.
For the first time in weeks, there was no tension, just a quiet acknowledgement of honesty and understanding. Both felt a weight lift from their shoulders. The pressure of unspoken questions, the curiosity that had once been confusing, and the expectations of the town that had hovered over them. Now, they could exist together in the same space without fear or uncertainty. But as the day went on, small moments continued to build their connection. They worked side by side, repairing fences, feeding the horses, and sharing quiet laughter over minor mistakes or stubborn animals. These were ordinary moments, but ordinary moments had become extraordinary because of the shared understanding between them. There was no rush, No pressure, only a gentle awareness of each other and the comfort of recognition. The townsfolk continued to observe, though their whispers had softened. The quiet acknowledgement between the cowboy and the newcomer had shifted the story. No longer was it a mystery or a point of speculation. Now it was simply part of life in Red Creek. People began to accept that some connections did not need loud declarations or explanations. They could exist quietly, meaningfully, and respectfully. One afternoon, a small challenge tested their newfound understanding. A young horse had gotten loose, running through the fields and skidding near the edge of the pasture. Both the cowboy and the newcomer sprang into action, moving quickly to guide the horse to safety. Bows. Their movements were synchronized, calm, and precise, reflecting the trust and awareness they had developed over the past weeks. The moment was tense, but it passed without incident, leaving a shared sense of accomplishment. Afterward, they stood together, catching their breath and watching the horse settle. There was a quiet satisfaction in their eyes, a recognition of the teamwork, patience, and understanding that had brought them through the moment safely. It was a small victory, but it symbolized the growth of their relationship, the ability to navigate tension, challenges, and curiosity with care and respect. As evening approached, the cowboy and the newcomer sat on a small hill overlooking the town. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. For the first time, there was no awkwardness, no hesitation, and no unspoken questions. They simply existed together, side by side, enjoying the calm of the evening and the shared experience of life in Red Creek.
I'm glad we
Figured things out, the cowboy said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. The newcomer smiled. We didn't rush it. We took the time to notice, understand, and respect. That's what matters. The cowboy nodded. I was afraid at first, afraid of what I felt, afraid of what the town might think, afraid of making mistakes. But now, it feels simple. Honest. Right. The newcomer agreed. It's always simpler when you speak openly and pay attention without judgment. Life is complicated enough. We don't need to make it harder by pretending or hiding what's true. The sun disappeared behind the hills and the first stars appeared in the sky. The cowboy and the newcomer stayed seated, watching the evening unfold. The town below carried on with its usual routines. Some people chatting on porches, others tending to small tasks, and still others returning from the fields. But above it all, there was a quiet peace between the two. They had navigated curiosity, tension, and misunderstanding to reach this point of mutual respect and awareness. Over the following days, their connection deepened naturally. Conversations became easier, gestures more relaxed, and laughter more frequent. They did not feel the need to define their relationship in labels or terms. Instead, they focused on understanding, observing, and respecting one another. The town continued to notice, but now it saw a partnership built on patience, care, and mutual recognition rather than curiosity, tension, or speculation. The cowboy felt a new sense of freedom. He could work alongside the newcomer without the awkward hesitation that had plagued him for weeks. He could acknowledge his feelings without fear or confusion, and he could enjoy their shared moments without expectation. The newcomer, in turn, felt understood, respected, and accepted, not just by the cowboy, but by themselves. They had navigated the delicate space between attention and personal boundaries, and they had emerged stronger, calmer, and more confident. By the end of the story, Red Creek returned to its quiet rhythm, but the lives of the cowboy and the newcomer had changed forever. They had learned important lessons about patience, observation, honesty, and understanding. They had faced unspoken tension, curiosity, and the weight of external judgment, and they had come through with a quiet, lasting connection that did not need dramatic gestures or public declarations. The final scene finds them working together in the stables, side by side, smiling quietly as the horses grazed in the fields. There was no rush, no pressure, No unnecessary words, only the calm presence of two people who had noticed, understood, and respected one another. They had reached a point of clarity, acceptance, and quiet contentment. In this simple, ordinary life, extraordinary growth had taken place. The tension that once defined their interactions had been replaced by understanding. The curiosity that had puzzled both of them had been expressed and acknowledged. And the judgment of the town, once a heavy weight, had become a backdrop to a personal connection that was honest, respectful, and enduring. As night fell over Red Creek, the cowboy and the newcomer sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge. They did not speak much, because words were not needed. The shared understanding, the quiet respect, and the patience that had brought them here were enough. Life in the small town continued. The horses rested in the stables, and the two of them existed together in a space of calm awareness and trust. It was a quiet ending, but a meaningful one. The story of tension, curiosity, and unspoken emotions had reached its conclusion. Both the cowboy and the newcomer had grown, learned, and come to a place of balance. And though the town would continue to watch, the true connection between them was private, enduring, and entirely their own. A reminder that patience, honesty, and observation could turn tension into understanding, curiosity into respect, and difference into quiet harmony.